All right, guys, Mr. Sherwin here. What we're going to talk about today is the Spanish American War and American imperialism. We've been talking about imperialism. You've been working on primary and secondary sources, understanding the role of America in imperialism, what was going on globally before American imperialism, and impacts of. You've got pros and cons. We've got different presidents, different areas of the world. So it's important that you completed your primary source before we get into the Spanish American War, which is really the best example of territory gained during this time period. So, to recap, this is what we call setting the historical context. What was happening prior to or during the same time? Well, remember that during the same time that we're going to talk about foreign policy things, we don't want to forget that at the same time, we haven't changed history as far as the time goes, we're just shifting. Because as we talked about, domestic policy during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, with these four presidents. Now we're going to focus on their foreign policy. So it's just nice to theme what we've learned in class. What we fixed at home, what still needed to be fixed, and now how are we going to deal with other countries? So remember, McKinley, election of 1896 versus William Jennings Bryan. Remember that was a big deal because the big business guys gave millions and millions of dollars to help William McKinley win, and because of that, more laissez-faire is going to continue, less regulation on businesses, more power to trust. That's his domestic policy. Roosevelt comes in after McKinley dies. Remember, the name of his policy at home was called the Square Deal. He wanted to help with his three C's: conservation, consumers, and corporations. Things like the Meat Inspection Act, things like national parks, things like allowing good trust and killing bad trust. He was a trust buster. But of course, he wasn't nearly as big of a trust buster or a bathtub buster as our friend William Howard Taft. Not nearly as aggressive, but remember, he was a trust buster, broke up twice as many trusts as Roosevelt did. During his tenure as president, we get the 16th and 17th Amendments, progressive amendments that farmers had wanted years and years ago. Also, we get more regulatory power to the Interstate Commerce Commission. We're going to get regulations of railroads, regulations of telephone and telegraph rates, and again, more regulatory power. So it's totally anti-laissez-faire, okay? And then Wilson, the final president of the Progressive Era, the final president really of this imperialism we're about to get into. He is vigorously antitrust, doesn't believe any trust should exist. He creates and helps create the Federal Reserve, which regulates interest rates and the money supply. And even though he was reluctant to do so, he is responsible for uh, having the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, ratified. Okay, so let's get into the foreign policy now of these same presidents. Okay, so just a nice little timeline to consider. So 1867, this is prior to these presidents, but through something called Seward's Folly, we'll get into that in just a minute. The United States buys Alaska from Russia. Russia can't really defend it. They need money. 1881, President Garfield is assassinated. Remember, the only thing to remember about him is his assassination, while tragic, will help lead to changes in what we call the spoils system or patronage. He was killed because, he would not give a job to one of his supporters. So one of the progressive reforms, even before the movement really, is something called the Pendleton Act, which eliminates patronage. Okay, 1893, Americans take over Hawaii. If you didn't know that, we're going to get into that. The big focus of our presentation today will be the Spanish-American War, 1898. Notice how there's not really another date because it's a very short war, very short, very impactful. 1904, under Teddy Roosevelt, construction of the Panama Canal begins. We'll talk about how we acquired that. And we'll also talk about how it became open under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. So it's going to take a minute to dig those miles and miles of canal. Okay, but keep in mind we still have progressivism during the same time period. Things like the antitrust lawsuits filed against U.S. Steel. So we still have big business all over the world. Now we're not now, but at the same time. We're not going to neglect our foreign policy obligations. So that's what this presentation is about. Okay. So looking at your notes, we're at number 11. How was Alaska acquired? Well, Alaska is purchased from Russia for $7.2 million, which ends up being about 2 cents an acre. It's the first major expansion of the United States territory outside of the lower 48. So we've already had this section for quite some time. With our acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Later, we get California. Later, we get places like Texas and New Mexico from the Mexican-American War. Later, we solve the border dispute between us and Britain and Oregon. So we have the lower 48. This is our first acquisition beyond that in 1867. So this is right after the Civil War. Uh, to give you some background on this, there was a senator. His name was William Seward. He thought this would be a great idea to buy Alaska. People thought he was crazy. They said he was foolish. They referred to Alaska as Seward's folly because, first thing you think about when you think of Alaska, you think cold, sort of tundra atmosphere. Why would we want this? Later, it becomes very valuable for the fishing industry, the oil industry, and they had a gold rush of sorts called the Klondike, where people would actually get geared up in places like Seattle, and they would travel through Canada all the way up and hit Alaska here, which really isn't that far away when you look at this sort of little sliver here that's on the western side of Canada. So major expansion. It is our largest state, if you did not know that. Okay. Annex. We're going to take over Hawaii. Okay. In the early 1800s, you'll see more about this later, but Hawaii was really valuable for a couple things. It was valuable for sugar. It was valuable for tropical fruit. It was also used for rest and relaxation from the long Pacific ship voyage from America to Asia and vice versa. And also was the base of operations for the whaling industry. Back before petroleum, how we got illumination was through whale oil. Okay, so it was a big market. Okay, a lot of countries were using the trade they would receive from Hawaii. This is when Hawaii was a kingdom. America wants to monopolize it. America wants to gain this strategic area in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for a lot of reasons. Okay. So if you look, next to, we've got Alaska up here in the northwest, obviously, and then really almost the middle. I guess you could say a little further east in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but pretty nice spot.
Good morning, Magnet Buffet. If
Oh,
you'd like to be tested for COVID, please
thank you
report to the
so much,
library
Miss
at this
Deborah.
time. Once again, if you'd like to be tested for COVID, please report to the library at this time. Thank you and have a great day.
All right, thank you for that announcement, Miss Deborah. COVID did not exist way back in 1867 when we